Good morning, DCC, and welcome to another Sunday morning service. Some announcements for you this morning. One Accord has recorded a separate worship set for those of you who have maybe missed worshiping to some of our favorite old hymns, and you can find that on our YouTube page. As always, remember that we have our weekly kids ministry video recorded by Miss Angela, which can also be found on our YouTube page as well. I'd just like to invite you to join with me in a time of prayer before we head into our worship this morning. Dear Lord, as we just reflect on a week of still being in quarantine, Lord, still being in the midst of this pandemic and facing some real injustice of this world, we just pray that as followers and lovers of you, Lord, that we would look to you in our response. Lord, that we would know that you are a God who bore all the weight of our worries and anxieties and injustice on the cross, and we are so thankful for that. We thank you for yet another week that we can continue to meet and continue to be a part of this community, Lord, of this family. Lord, we love you and we thank you. Amen.
I'm glad you've joined us for worship. We're going to sing to the King.
Sing to the King who is coming to reign. Glory to Jesus, the Lamb that was slain. Life and salvation, his empire shall reign. And joy to the nations when Jesus is King. Sing a song declaring that we belong to Jesus. He is all we need. Lift up a heart of praise. Sing now with voices raised to Jesus. Sing to the King. For his returning we watch and we pray. We will be ready the dawn of that day. We'll join in singing with all the redeemed, 'cause Satan is vanquished and Jesus is King. Let us sing a song declaring that we belong to Jesus. He is all we need. Lift up a heart of praise. Sing now with voices raised to Jesus. Sing to the King. Sing to the King. Come down. Let us sing a song declaring that we belong to Jesus. He is all we need. Lift up a heart of praise. Sing now with voices raised to Jesus. Sing to the King. Sing to the King. Sing to the King.
You who made the mountains and the sea, measured out the universe, and you made me. Echoes of a voice that called the worlds to be. Reach throughout the ages and now speak to me. You're my Creator King.
You have made the valleys and the sky, displayed your
darkness and the light, sun and moon to watch the day and guard the night, hand that stretch the heavens like a canopy, reaches down to cover and watch over me. You're my Creator King. Who am I that you are mindful of me? Who am I that you set your love on me? Who am I that you are mindful of me? Who am I that you set your love on me? You're my Creator King. You're my Creator King. You're my Creator King. Do you feel the world is broken? We do. Do you feel the shadows deepen? We do. But do you know that all the darkness won't stop the light from getting through? We do. Do you wish that you could see it all made new? We do. Is all creation groaning? It is. Is a new creation coming? It is. Is the glory of the Lord to be the light within our midst? It is. Is it good that we remind ourselves of this? It is. Is anyone worthy? Is anyone whole? Is anyone able to break the seal and open the scroll? The Lion of Judah, who conquered the grave, he is David's root and the Lamb who died to ransom the slave. Is he worthy? Is he worthy of all blessing and honor and glory? Is he worthy of this? He is.
Does the Father truly love us?
He does.
Does the Spirit move among us?
He does.
And does Jesus, our Messiah, hold forever those he loves?
He does.
Does our God intend to dwell again with us?
He does. Is anyone worthy? Is anyone whole? Is anyone able to break the seal and open the scroll? The Lion of Judah, who conquered the grave. He is David's root and the Lamb who died to ransom the slain. From every people and tribe, from every nation and tongue, He has made us a kingdom and priests to God to reign with the Son. Is He worthy? Is He worthy of all blessing and honor and glory? Is He worthy? Is He worthy? Is He worthy of this? He is He worthy? Is He worthy? He is. Into your courts we come, deep in our hearts we long to be near to the throne of your glory. As we draw near to you, know that we're here to do your will. God, how we long to be near to you. May our prayers be like incense rising up to your throne. May our songs be a fragrance unto you. May our lives be as pleasing offerings in all that we do. God, how we long to be near to you. God, how we long to be near to you. Your courts we come, deep in our hearts we long to be near to the throne of your glory. As we draw near to you, know that we're here to do your will. God, how we long to be near to you. May our prayers be like incense rising up to your throne. May our songs be a fragrance unto you. May our lives be as pleasing offerings in all that we do. God, how we long to be near to you. we long to be near to you. May our prayers be like incense rising up to your throne. May our songs be a fragrance unto you. May our lives be as pleasing offerings in all that we do. God, how we long to be near to you. God, how we long to be near to you. Faithful one, so unchanging, ageless one, you're my rock of peace, Lord alone. I depend on you. I call out to you again and again. I call out to you again and again. You are my rock in times of trouble. You lift me up when I fall down. All through the storm, your love is the anchor. My hope is in you alone. Faithful one, so unchanging,
Good morning. If this is your first time tuning in this morning, we just want to say thank you for joining us today. My name is Pastor Chris, and I'm the lead pastor here at Dresden Community Church, and we could not be happier that you have chosen to spend this Sunday morning with us. And for all of you out there who call DCC home, I just want you to know how much we miss seeing your faces. I mean, this bare congregation will do for now, but I can't wait to see you once again in this room here with me. And I know that this has been a long season. I know that this has been a long and a hard season for many of you out there, but I firmly believe in the bottom of my heart that God is going to bring us through this stronger and closer than ever. And already He is doing things that would not have even been possible had this not happened. So if we continue to rely and trust Him through this process, I think we're going to see some amazing things happen between now and when we get to meet together again. Will you pray with me this morning? Father God, we just give this morning to you. We ask you to take this time, take this space, even though we are separate but together. And I pray that you would knit us with your Spirit and that you would speak directly to our souls. God, now more than ever, we need your truth, we need your wisdom, we need your Spirit, and we need your direction. And I pray for all of these things now to flow in remarkable ways. In Jesus' name, amen. Over the past few years, God has been teaching me something, probably one of the most important things about the power of a frame. God has been continually reminding me and teaching me the power of a frame. If you've never heard that term before, a frame is the way that you look at a situation. It's how you process what's happening in your life. When something happens or you get news about you or your family or your loved ones, instantly as human beings, we just put a frame around it to try and understand what that situation is and how we should feel about it. Let me see if I can give you an example. Let's say tomorrow morning I told you that I was going to come and wake you up at 3 a.m. in the morning. How would you feel? Turn to the person beside you and say, "Don't you dare wake me up at 3 a.m. If I was to come to your house and knock on the door and ring your phone and tell you it's time to get up at 3 a.m., how would you feel? You'd probably be upset, wouldn't you? You might be angry, you might be irritated because I was robbing you of something that you value and that you desire. I was taking sleep from you. If you're a parent of a young kid, you're probably up anyway, so it wouldn't matter too much. Now, let's say instead of me telling you that I was simply going to wake you up at 3 a.m., let's say I told you that tomorrow morning I'm going to wake you up at 3 a.m. and there is going to be a limo waiting for you outside your door. And then it's going to take you and me to the airport and we're going to fly to Jamaica and we're going to spend a week there together, all my treat. How would you feel then? By the way, let's just be clear here. We are not going to Jamaica next week. I don't think anybody's going to Jamaica right now. You see, the funny thing is, it is the same situation, isn't it? Only the second time I told you why we were doing what we were doing. It's the same time in the morning that we were going to wake up and you would felt one way, irritated, and like someone was taking something from you. But once I told you the reason why we were doing it, you would be excited about tomorrow morning coming. And all of these things, what they actually are is they're called frames. You're framing the situation. You are framing the circumstance. The term comes from a picture frame, the wooden frames that we hang around pictures and photographs and paintings. About 15 years ago, I actually bought the very first painting that I had ever bought in my life, like actual real painting. Not something that you walk through IKEA and put in the cart or pick up on a Walmart shelf, but an actual painting by an artisan who painted himself. He was traveling through the Barrie area and he met me in some parking lot. It was the weirdest circumstantial situation. And I ended up buying this picture not just because it was beautiful, because it was a picture of the Sea of Galilee. And it was a lifelong dream of mine to spend some time along that incredible body of water. And so it was this beautiful painting of a stone wall and two chairs sitting off looking onto the Sea of Galilee. And I remember I took it home, but when you buy these paintings from artisans, they just come in a cardboard matte frame. All it is a few inches of cheap cardboard that has been cut with a knife, and you roll it up into a ball until you take it home. And I remember when I got it home, I had every intention of taking it to a professional framer. I had every intention of making this look like the beautiful piece of artwork that it was, but as soon as I found out that the frame was going to cost more than the painting, I was out. We were freshly married, and this just wasn't high on our to-do list. So for years, this beautiful picture of the Sea of Galilee, it sat on the floor, semi-curled up in my bedroom, and sometimes even behind our headboard. And if you were to come over to my house and you were to look at this picture lying there curled on the floor, you would probably be pretty hard-pressed to be impressed. But if I was to go out and pay a beautiful and professional framer to make it happen, and if I was to hang it on the wall with a few lights shining on it, if you were to see this painting, you would be blown away at how beautiful it was and full of texture and depth. And the only difference between those two things was a frame. You see, frames have the power to change how you feel about a situation or a thing. And what I want you to realize as we get started this morning is that the same thing is true with life and the circumstances that you and I find ourselves in. Is the way that you frame it and the way that you look at it has everything to do with how you will feel about it going forward. Let me see if I can give you another example. I'm a parent and I have 3 young kids. And those of you who go to this church, you know how wonderful and amazing and how active they are. They are life of the party kind of kids. They are incredibly verbal. They are active and talented, and they are always buzzing and running around. And if you think that's just here that they do that, come over to my house sometime. It is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so often I can remember when I was young and we were parenting these young kids, we were trying everything we could just to keep up with them. The main goal at the end of the day was to keep them alive and for us to survive. And almost every week there would be somebody who would come up to me or come up to Mel and they would invariably say the same thing. They would look at our kids as we chased Zoe down the hall and they would look at me and they'd say, "Boy, your kids are active, aren't they? They're a real lively bunch." And I would turn back at them and I would smile, thinking inside my head, "Thank you for the news flash, Captain Obvious. I appreciate you pointing that out to me because I wasn't aware at the moment that this is the kind of children that I had." They would say, "Boy, those kids are lively, aren't they? They never stop, do they?" And whenever people would say that to me, they thought they were just making conversation, but you know what it did inside me is it just made me feel more tired because it focused me on the fact that they were so incredibly busy. But you know what? Every once in a while, for every 5 of those comments, one person would come up to me, usually an older person whose kids had grown up and left the house. They would come up to me, and I heard this from several different people, and they would say the same thing at first. They would say, "Boy, that's a lively bunch." And I would say, yeah, they are. And then they would say this. They would say, "But you wouldn't have it any other way, would you?" And I remember the first time I heard that, I thought to myself, what do you mean I wouldn't have it any other way? Absolutely, I would have it another way. If we could just slow down for 1 hour a day. But they would say, "You wouldn't have it any other way, would you?" And it took me a little while to realize what they were saying. What they were saying was, if your kids were sick and they were lying on a couch, you would be begging the Lord to see them doing what they are doing right now. You see, this is what healthy kids do. Healthy kids run and play and scream and yell and play games together. And they were saying that if your kids were unwell, you would hope to God that He would make them as lively as they are today. They were saying you should be thankful that God has given you 3 vibrant and healthy young children. And whenever somebody would come and say that to me instead, my whole frame would shift. I remember when they would say that to me, all of a sudden I would start to feel this deep sense of gratitude well up inside me. And it wasn't superficial because I realized in that moment that they were absolutely right. And the few times that my kids have been sick, even with something for a few weeks, I've already started to beg the Lord to return them to this state that we had known them as. They were saying, be grateful that your kids are as healthy as they are. And here is the crazy thing. As I felt that gratefulness and gratitude well up within me and dodged a flying object that may have been whizzing by my face, it is the same situation as it was before, only a different frame. Do you see? It is the same situation it was the day before, only a different lens and a frame for you to view it through. You see, thinking that you're exhausted running around after your kids, that is a frame and it will affect you in a certain way. But being grateful for the incredible gift that God has given you, that is a frame and it will affect you completely differently. And right now in this pandemic, you and I, we have a frame for what's going on. You have a frame for all the news articles that you are seeing and the stories that you are reading about. And my question for you is this, what is your frame? What is your frame for what's going on right now? Is this just one giant hopeless disaster? Or is this a holy shaking that God is doing something in our midst? Which one of these two things is going on for you? Is this just some hopeless disaster and we're going to just somehow find a way to survive through this? Or is God enabling us to thrive in the midst of this chaos and to do things that couldn't have been possible before? When you look around, do you only see obstacles or do you see opportunities? You see, this is the power of a frame in your life and in mine, and it is more important now than it probably ever has been for you and me before. And you know what? In the scriptures and in the Bible, God is doing this more than anything. He is trying to get you to exchange your frame for His. He's trying to get you to change the way that you look at a situation and replace it with the way that He looks at a situation, because you and I need to see things the way that He sees them, to act the way that He has called us to. We need to look at life through the lens of Jesus' eyes, not just through our own disappointment or our own confusion. We need to trade our frame in for His. I want to make you a promise this morning. If you are willing and able to do that, if you are willing and able to even attempt and to try to trade with God for the lens you have, with the lens that He is trying to give you, it will make a massive difference in the way that you think and feel and act in your everyday life. You see, I think that that's what God is trying to do with us now, not just about this church, but about your family and about work and about your future and about your finances. He is trying to change the frame and the way in which you view these things and to exchange them for a biblical and a heavenly viewpoint. And as we continue this morning in the story of Joseph, you are going to realize how incredibly important and powerful one frame is compared with another. Let's read together this morning, Genesis chapter 40. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, and the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, "In my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in his hand." "This is what it means," Joseph said to him. "The 3 branches are 3 days, and within 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison, for I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he then said to Joseph, "I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. And this is what it means," Joseph said. "Those 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh." Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials, and he restored the chief cupbearer into his position so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker just as Joseph has said to them in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. So let me ask you something this morning. As we have traveled now nearly to the halfway point of Joseph's story, if you were Joseph in this moment, how would you feel? Like if you had traveled where Joseph had traveled, and if you had been through the situations that you had been through as you sat there in that dungeon staring through the thinly spaced bars, how would you be feeling in this moment? If God had given you dreams about your future and all of a sudden all that turned into was your brother selling you out and selling you into a slave caravan that dragged you to Egypt. And then you ascended the ranks in Egypt inside of Potiphar's house, and then you were falsely accused even though you did nothing wrong, and you were thrown in a dungeon. And there you stayed in the dungeon while it seemed like life continued on outside the walls of that prison, and you continued to simply move around and do the things that you were able to do. How would you be feeling in this moment right now? Probably a whole lot of woe is me, wouldn't you? Probably a whole lot of woe is me. How many of you out there tend to throw a bit of a pity party when life just seems like the bottom falls out? How many of you tend to just sit there and sulk for a little while in certain situations? You see, I've heard the phrase where people say, you know what, life can always get worse, so be thankful for the things that are going well, and that is the gospel truth. Life always can get worse, but if I was Joseph and I was rotting away in that cell staring through those bars, I think I would have asked God, how much lower can this elevator go? How much worse can things get? And so I've been thinking as we have been diving deep into the story of Joseph, how has Joseph been interpreting all of this? How has he been processing it and thinking about it? And how is he staying so faithful to God in the midst of all of these trials? And verse 6 is this amazing verse that maybe you didn't catch as we were passing through it. But verse 6 is the verse where Joseph comes back into the prison portion where the other two members of Pharaoh's household are held, and they were sad and dejected. And this is what he says to them. He comes up to them and he says, "Why are your faces so sad? Why are you guys downcast? Why aren't you happy this morning?" And you see, that just struck me when I read it, and I was thinking about it because if I was the cupbearer or I was the baker, I would turn back to Joseph and I would say, "Joseph, why isn't yours? I mean, look around. We are in prison. We have no idea when we are going to get out. We spend our entire days locked away, and the truth is your story is even worse than ours. Why aren't you sad?" But Joseph, he is focused on the other people around him in this prison, and he looks at these two men and he says, "Why are your faces so downcast? Why are you sad today?" And each of them tells them that they had a dream the night before and no one could interpret it. They simply did not know what it means. So Joseph, with the gift that God had given him and the trust that he had placed in God, he says, "Listen, I can't interpret dreams, but the living God can. And if you tell me what they are, I can tell you what they mean." And sure enough, after listening to the stories and the dreams of these two men, he interprets it for them. And he tells the first man, the cupbearer, that 3 days he was going to be lifted up and he was going to be rescued from this prison and he was going to be restored back to the position that he was in. And the baker, who was hoping to catch on the tails of this interpretation, says, "Well, what about mine?" And Joseph says, "In 3 days, Pharaoh is going to lift off your head and this is going to be the end of your story." Two diverging paths from the same prison. And true enough, 3 days later, Pharaoh threw a feast and invited both back, and everything that Joseph had predicted happened. Not because Joseph was somehow especially clairvoyant or gifted, but because God knew the future, and he showed Joseph what was going to take place. And so in this situation, you have Joseph who begs the cupbearer with a simple request. He turns to him and he says, "Please, when you leave here, don't forget about me. When you leave here, please just remember me and tell somebody that I am in here because I did nothing to deserve being here. And I was dragged here against my own will and thrown in prison even though I did nothing wrong. Please, when you leave this place, after what I have done for you, please remember me." And yet, the king's personal taster forgot about him completely. He didn't remember him. In fact, you read the next verse in chapter 41 and we find out for 2 years. For 2 years, the cupbearer of the king forgot about Joseph. And it wasn't until Pharaoh himself had a dream that no one could interpret that his mind remembered and the synapses connected. And he says, "Oh, right. There was a guy in prison who interpreted my dream. Oh, Pharaoh, maybe he can interpret yours." And so again, for Joseph, you have more waiting, more disillusionment, more long gray stretches. And if you were Joseph, 2 years passed after you had done this for these great men, how would you be feeling and what would you be thinking? I think if you were being honest with yourself, and if I was being honest, you would probably feel abandoned. You would feel alone. Maybe you would even feel forgotten. You would probably even start to wonder if God was somehow mad at you and all of this was some sort of punishment for something that you had done in the past. Because your mind tends to race for an explanation when life does not make sense and you have a good God and a bad situation and you cannot seem to fit them together. You start to try all of the other explanations to see what fit. I mean, this is exactly the accusations of Job's friends after his life fell apart. They said, Job, you must have done something wrong. Job, God must be punishing you for what you did. You must have somehow sinned and not known it, or God is showing you something and teaching you something and somehow grinding out of you the darkness that you allowed to creep in. These were the accusations of Job's supposed friends, when in reality he had done nothing wrong. And so we find ourselves in these dark situations sometimes, and we tend to feel that way. And if you have ever been in a deep and a long valley before, maybe you have felt these kinds of emotions and these kinds of questions for God as well. God, why don't you say something? God, you can see what's happening in my life right now. You can see the bars in front of me. You can see the tiny window up in the corner of the stone wall. God, why don't you say something? Why don't you do something? And the question I want to ask you this morning is this. Because I think the truth is we have all been there at some point in times in our lives, and maybe even in the season you are right there right now. The question I want to ask you is this. What if in those moments, what if in those situations and in those valleys, what if in those moments God isn't punishing you? What if He is positioning you? What if in these situations that none of us enjoy and none of us want to go through, what if God isn't punishing you? What if He is actually positioning you for something greater in the future? You see, this question, it tends to open a whole new world. I know it has for me, and I will pray that it does for you. Because if you start to look at Joseph's story, one moment it looks like everything is lost. One moment in this story, because God does not telegraph, God does not let you know what is going to happen next. One moment it looks like he is going to rot in this prison for the rest of his life. And the next moment, 10 verses later, he is standing in the courts of Pharaoh, interpreting his dream and being promoted to the second in command in all of Egypt. 10 verses later, Joseph's story entirely changes. There is a day at which he thinks he is never going to see the outside of these walls. And then there is a day that he sees the entire world open up before him, and it is only 10 verses apart. And you start to look back at Joseph's story, and you see the ways in which God was positioning him for exactly this moment. He did not know it then. He could not see it then. But God was perfectly positioning and preparing him for this exact moment in time. And as you start to look back at Joseph's story, as you turn the angle of your telescope and your lens, and instead of looking forward, you look back. And by the way, God's plans always make more sense looking backwards than they do looking forwards. Amen? God's plan always comes together so much more looking backwards and seeing His hand than trying to look forwards. And so you look backwards at Joseph's story, you see all the ways that God had been pouring and preparing and positioning him for this incredible future that He had planned. You see, God is doing so much more in these situations than you and I could ever realize. And I want you to know this morning that not a single moment of your life has been wasted. Not a single situation has been tossed aside and needlessly entered into, because God has a plan and He is working it out in your life and mine. And I want to ask you this morning this question that I hope sticks with you. What if when life falls apart or seems like it isn't turning out the way you want it, what if God isn't punishing you? What if He is positioning you? What if He is preparing you for what He has next? Do you see how that changes the way that you look at the situations that you were in, and maybe even the situation that you are in right now? Rudyard Kipling, he wrote a famous poem. It was just called If. And there was one line in the poem that has stuck with me. To be honest, I don't quote poetry often. In fact, I can't even remember the last time I did, but this line has stuck with me through the years, and this is what he said. He said, "Meet with triumph and disaster, and treat both impostors just the same." Meet with triumph and disaster and treat both impostors just the same. And when life has not gone the way that I have wanted to, I have gone back to that quote and remembered that not all disasters are actually disasters once you see the plan of God work its way through. Not all bad situations are actually bad situations when you see the way that God is using and preparing you through them and for something in the future. Not all closed doors are actually closed doors to your future, but they are redirections to the path that He actually wants you on. Meet with triumph and disaster and treat both impostors just the same. You see, sometimes the toughest moments that we are in are exactly the moments that God is placing you where He wants you and needs you to be. And if you reread the story of Joseph, go back from chapter 41 in reverse. Look back through the plan of God and you will see this intricate and beautiful and wonderful thread that God has weaved through His story. You see, God had been building into Joseph three remarkable things in this time of waiting, in this time of testing. God had been building things into him, into his soul, and into his life that he was going to need when He called him upwards and farther in. And the first of these three things is character. God was building into Joseph remarkable character. Because in just a few chapters, He was going to call Joseph into a position of leadership that none in the land of Egypt have ever experienced except the Pharaoh himself. He was going to call him up to second in command, and he was going to rescue the entire land of Egypt and Israel from a famine that may have wiped most of them out. He was going to call him to a remarkably powerful position of leadership. But here's the thing, leadership requires character. See, that's the problem with most of the leadership that we see these days, is that they're not lacking in skill, they are lacking in character. And even more so, godly leadership requires godly character. And God needs to sow these things and build these things into you before He calls you up into the position of leadership that He is going to. See, this is the story of Joseph. Those long, hard tests of faith that Joseph went through, they were God's way of building these into Joseph's soul, building faith and trust and strength and perseverance. God was forging them into the soul of Joseph the way a master blacksmith forges iron. You see, character is forged in the fire, and Joseph's fire was Potiphar's house and the dungeon, and it is tested in adversity, just like iron in the fire. And God was building Joseph with the character that he needed to carry out the plan that He had for him in the future. And God needed Joseph to be ready for the immense responsibility of leadership that He was about to give him, but He needed to get him ready before He promoted him to this position of leadership. So I want to ask you this morning, is there anything in your life where God is testing you? Is there anything in your life where God is developing your character, where He is refining you, where He is building into you? Is there any area of your life right now where God is strengthening your character in such a way that He is preparing you for the future? I want to challenge you to look at these difficult and challenging situations in a different way this morning. Because I want to ask you this, what if it isn't just pain? What if it's preparation? What if the situation that you are in right now isn't just pain? What if it is actually preparation for the future like it was for Joseph? I guarantee you that will change the way you look at it as you are struggling through this moment. See, it wasn't just character that God was building into Joseph. He was also building something else. He was building connections into Joseph's life and into his sphere of influence. You see, God had a plan for Joseph that we see now. We get to see the sketches of what it is, and we're going to continue to learn as we move forward. But what Joseph didn't realize is every step that he took, it didn't look like it in the moment, but every step that he took was actually one step closer to the promotion and the leadership that God had for him. Every step that Joseph took felt like a step down, but it was actually a step up, moving towards the plan that God had for his life. You see, the thing is, God needed Joseph in Egypt, but he couldn't be second in command behind Pharaoh while he was still in Israel, so He brought him to Egypt. And God needed Joseph in Pharaoh's inner circle because not anybody gets a hearing with the king, so He placed him in a dungeon beside Pharaoh's inner circle. And then He had him interpret a dream to which the cupbearer was going to be standing there beside the king when he had a dream that no one else could interpret. And God was each time positioning Joseph in exactly the right place to move His plan forward. He was positioning him with the right people in the right places at the right time. And I want to ask you this morning, is it possible that God is doing that with you today? Even in this situation that we are in right now, is God placing certain people in your life that are going to have a key role in your future going forward, or you in theirs? What if these people that are around you aren't just there by accident? What if it's not just random? What if there is a very deliberate reason why these people are in your life right now at this point in this time for such a time as this? Would that change the way that you treat them? Would that change the way that you think about them? Would that change the way that you pray for them or respond to them? What if these people aren't there by accident? What if they are a part of his plan for you? And the third thing that God was building into Joseph is he was building critical skills into his inventory. He was building critical skills that he was going to need for the plan that God had for him in the future. You see, it's interesting, you watch the story and look at the skills that God had developed in Joseph. Because everywhere that Joseph went, every place that Joseph went, God put him in charge. Everywhere that Joseph landed, God put him in a position of leadership, whether it was the prison or Potiphar's house. He was always in charge of people. He was managing money. He was managing people. He was learning to lead. He was dispensing decisions and making choices and earning trust with those above him. Everywhere that Joseph went, if you noticed, he was in a position of leadership. And you see, what God was doing was he was preparing Joseph for the massive leap that he was going to take in just a few weeks or months or years from those moments. God was building into him the critical skills that he was going to need to dispense the calling that God had given him. And not just leadership skills, interpreting dreams. God gave him opportunities to use this, and maybe there were others that we don't even know about, to hear others' dreams and to tell them what they mean. Dream interpretation that he was going to need to interpret the dream of Pharaoh as he stood in his courts to rocket him to his next phase in his journey. And you look back and you see all the ways that God was preparing him for exactly this moment. See, there was no neon sign over Joseph's head when he was learning these skills where God was saying, pay attention to this. You were going to need this. Don't you wish there was? Where you could know what was going to be important and what wasn't. There was no place, no writing in the sky that said, Joseph, you were going to need these skills, so apply yourself to them. Put yourself wholeheartedly into this, even though it doesn't seem like it's making a difference. But it was. And not only was it making a difference, this is exactly what God was going to use to change the world and to save the known world at the time. So what is God training you in right now that just seems kind of trivial at the moment? What has God been teaching you? What kind of skills that don't seem necessarily like spiritual skills, or maybe they don't apply to where you think you are going? What is God teaching you right now that you're not entirely sure is important, but just might be critical to where he is taking you next? Don't brush them off. Don't downplay these things that God is teaching you, because you just might need them in remarkable ways when God calls you forward. When God calls your number, you just might need these things more than you ever could have imagined. As I was writing this week, I was just thinking about this truth, and I thought about the situation that we are in right now. I am in an empty room with the exception of maybe 20 or 30 bears that are staring at me, and a few of them are encouraging me with words like yes, and preach, and word, and amen. But you know what? There is nobody else in this building, and for the last 2 years I thought back, and slowly God has been teaching me how to use tech that was required to make this happen. He's teaching me how to use video cameras, teaching me how to post things online, teaching me how to edit video, how to change sound, how to fix lighting. And you know what? At the time, they just seemed like little curiosities of mine. They just seemed like little things that sounded like a little bit of fun and might be helpful for the church maybe one day in the future. And as of 2 months ago, I look back and I see God's hand and thumbprint on every one of those moments. Every one of those decisions, every one of those afternoons where I crawled up on scaffolding to change lights, and where I spent hours researching different cameras. It doesn't sound spiritual, does it? But God knew where we were going to be in March of 2020. God knew what we were going to need to do, and he was preparing. He was preparing you and me for these moments. He was teaching us the skills and me the skills that we were going to need for him to carry his plan forward. So I want to challenge you not to think of these things as trivial. Think of them as training. These aren't just trivial skills. They are training for what God has in store for you next. You see, I told you weeks ago that we were going to hit a pivot point in the story of Joseph. I told you that in one moment, everything was going to shift and the page was going to turn. And you were going to look at Joseph in a story dramatically different, and we are at that pivot point right now, because the beginning of chapter 41 is the turning point of all of Joseph's life. The 12 years before were going to be entirely different than the next 50 or 60 or 70 afterwards. This is where everything changes. And what you realize at that pivot point is this, is that everything that happened beforehand was in preparation for everything that was going to happen after. Everything that God was doing in his life was in preparation for where he was going to take him in the future. And you see all the incredible providential ways that God had been preparing him for this exact moment, and this hand of God weaving the thread of providence through all of his situations. And what I want you to realize this morning is this, is that God is doing this with you. It's not just Joseph. Joseph is here to teach us about what God is doing in all of our lives, and God is doing exactly this with you in your situation, in your friendships, in your future. God is doing this with you. And he wants you to change out that lens, that frame that you have been using, looking at the situation, thinking that it is difficult or hard, or that it is somehow hopeless. He wants you to break that frame and throw it out and take the one that he is providing for us here in the story of Joseph. He wants you to realize that he isn't punishing you. He is preparing you for what he has next. I once heard somebody say that God will never waste a single one of your tears. It's a profound thought. God will never waste a single one of your tears, and he will never waste a single moment of your life. And everything that you have been through and everything that you will go through is not just because it is for a purpose that God is using for good in your life and the people around you and to further the plan. He will never waste a single one of your tears. And Joseph's story is case in point. Not one was wasted, and he won't with yours. I want to leave you with a story today as we wrap up this portion of Joseph's life. And it's actually the story of how I wound up here. I was thinking about this passage. I was thinking about this entire series for months in advance. And I was starting to think about the ways that God led us here to DCC. And before I came here, I was a lead interim pastor at a church not too far away. I was the interim lead pastor of a church of people that I had grown to love and that I cared about immensely. And I remember I spent 2 years building remarkable relationships with these people. There's so many good experiences and such a strong knit and connection with them. You see, the funny thing, though, about an interim lead pastor is that everything is interim. Everything is uncertain. The future is never quite clear. You never know if you're coming or going or staying or leaving, and it just kind of creates this cloud of uncertainty around everything that happens, and it was probably the hardest portion of that for me. And towards the end of that 2 years, I had been preaching and teaching and leading this group of people. Towards the end of that 2 years, I thought for sure that God was going to keep us there. It just felt like it was working so well and that God was doing good things. I thought that this was where God was going to keep us, me and Mel, together. And I had seen a future for everything, and I was really hopeful, except at the end of 2 years, it's just not the way it worked out. In reality, the simplistic version of the situation is even though 98% of the church was in favor of me staying, there were a few people in a few key positions that just couldn't quite get their heads wrapped around a 26-year-old lead pastor. There were a few people who just couldn't quite wrap their heads around the fact that someone so young could be in a position of a church that was the few hundred people that was going through such a season of transition. You see, there were a few people who always made references to radio preachers from the 50s and 60s, and I never knew who they were talking about. And I could never join in the Southern gospel songs that they sang because I'd never listened to it. In fact, I was actually younger than most of their grandkids, so as they looked at the future, they just couldn't see it was such a young, baby-faced pastor at the pulpit. And so 2 years wrapped up, and that was the end of my term there. And to be honest with you, I was kind of heartbroken. You see, I loved that church. I loved those people. I loved what I was doing, and I saw such a future for them and for that situation. I saw so much potential. But at the end of the day, it didn't work out. Not so much a few days after I had gotten word that this was going to be the end of my term with this church, I got a call from some guy named Colin Patterson. Many of you know him. I got a call from some guy named Colin Patterson. You see, news travels fast. It doesn't take more than 48 hours for things to travel in the Christian circle in 150 miles. And so he called me and he said he wanted to talk about an opportunity here. And then a few weeks later, I got a call from a guy named Todd Lozon, whose son I had pastored in a church that I had been at previously. And he also said, come, let's have a talk. Let's discuss an opportunity here. And that was the beginning of the road that led Mel and I here. It was the beginning of the road that led Mel and I to this church. And now it has been 9 years that we have been here with you. 9 years that we have seen God do some amazing things in our midst. 9 years that we have seen God change lives and move us forward at an incredible church. 9 years that we are wildly grateful for as a couple. But it was an opportunity. It was an opportunity that we got to see God work in amazing ways. It was an opportunity that began with a closed door. An opportunity that began with a situation that didn't turn out the way that I thought it would. It was an opportunity that God used a difficult situation to move us into. So the next time that you feel like life isn't going as you planned, which, by the way, for me happens quite often. The next time that you feel like life isn't progressing as fast as you planned or in the direction that you planned, I want you to hear me this morning. Don't panic. Don't panic. Don't get discouraged. Don't let the enemy worm his way into your life and speak untruths about what is happening to you. And do not throw a pity party. What I want you to do is to change your frame. To change the way that you look at the situation that you are in and ask God for the strength and the wisdom to see things the way that He does. And instead of looking at this like He is punishing you, start looking at this like He is positioning you, because He has a wonderful and incredible plan for your life. And He is spending all of these moments getting you ready for Him. Remember Joseph's story. Not a single moment is wasted. I promise if you can recognize this and you can realize this, you will never look at a difficult situation the same again. In fact, you will never look at your life the same way again, because every moment, every situation now has a purpose, because God is positioning you. Let's pray together. Father, I pray that you would take this truth and that you would sow it deep into the hearts of all those who are listening right now. And God, C.S. Lewis once said that sometimes we need to be reminded more often than we need to be taught. So I pray that you would lock this away and sear it somewhere in their hearts and souls, so that the next time that they are facing difficulty, the next time they are facing resistance or pain, the next time they are facing something hard or walking through the valley, that you would remind them of this simple sentence. Remind them of this question. Force them to ask themselves, what if God isn't punishing me? What if He is positioning me and preparing me for the future? God, with that frame in mind, I pray that you would change the scope of so many individuals and families and hearts in this congregation in all directions where this is going out. In the powerful name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.